The letter was not addressed to anyone, and that was precisely what made Owen Talbot read every single word of it. He had stopped at the Sweetwater relay station just outside of Laramie, Wyoming territory, on a Thursday afternoon in the spring of 1878, dusty from 3 days of riding and hungry enough to eat the saddle off his horse. The relay station was a modest affair, nothing more than a long timber building with a hitching post out front, a water trough that needed cleaning, and a man named Burl who ran the place with the enthusiasm of a man who had given up on enthusiasm entirely. Owen had handed over his horse to the station boy, walked inside, and ordered a plate of beans and whatever bread was left from the morning. It was while he was waiting, leaning back against the rough wooden counter and scanning the small room with tired eyes, that he noticed the Bible on the windowsill. It was a plain thing, black-covered and worn at the corners, the kind of Bible that passed through 100 hands before it came to rest anywhere permanent. He would not have thought twice about it, except that a folded piece of paper was sticking out from between the pages like a bookmark, and something about the way it sat there, slightly crooked, slightly desperate, made him reach for it. He told himself later that he did not know why he opened the letter. He had never been a man who pried into other people's affairs. He had spent 31 years of his life minding his own business, working cattle for other men's ranches, sleeping under open skies, and keeping his conversation to polite necessities. But he opened that letter, and nothing was the same after. The handwriting was careful and even, but the pressure of the pen told a different story. Whoever had written these words had pressed hard, with urgency, with something close to desperation. The paper itself was fine quality, the kind a woman of some education might carry, and it smelled faintly of lavender, which struck him as the saddest thing he had ever encountered in a relay station that smelled primarily of horses and wood smoke. The letter read, "To whoever might find this, I leave it here because I have no one to send it to and nowhere left to turn. My name is Marcella Alden. I am 24 years old and I am traveling west from Cheyenne on the Thursday stage, though I do not yet know where I will stop, as I have no destination set and very little money left to my name. I was to be married in Cheyenne to a man named Gerald Pratt, but I could not go through with it, as he is not a kind man and I believed he would do me harm. I left before dawn and took nothing but my trunk and what savings I had hidden away. I am not a foolish woman, but I am a frightened one, and I am writing this down because the relay station keeper said I could leave a Bible here for the next traveler, and it felt necessary to leave some record of where I have been in case anyone ever wondered. I am a schoolteacher by training. I can work. I do not want to be a burden to anyone. If anyone reads this and knows of honest work or a decent place where a woman traveling alone might find her footing, I would be grateful to know of it. God willing, I will land somewhere safe. Marcella Alden." Owen read it twice. Then he read it a third time, more slowly, the way a man reads something he is trying to commit to memory. Burl set his plate of beans on the counter and said something, but Owen did not hear it. He was still holding the letter with both hands, reading the line about the man who was not kind, reading the line about being frightened, reading the name at the bottom. Marcella Alden. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket, which sat directly over his heart without any particular intent but which later felt like a sign he should have recognized immediately. He ate his beans without tasting them. He asked Burl how long ago the Thursday stage had come through. Burl scratched his chin. Thursday stage, that would have been, about 4 days back, maybe 5. Where did it stop after here? Could have gone to Rawlins, could have cut south to Carbon City. Hard to say. Depends on what the driver felt like and whether they had any mail freight to deliver. Burl studied him with mild suspicion. You looking for someone? Owen thought about the letter. He thought about the lavender smell and the careful handwriting and the woman who had pressed her pen hard against the paper because she needed someone to know she had been real and she had been there and she had been trying. Maybe, he said. He stayed the night at the relay station, sleeping in the small bunk room in the back with two other cowboys who were heading to Rawlins for the spring cattle drive. He lay awake long after they were snoring, staring at the low ceiling and telling himself he was a grown man with his own business to attend to, that he had a job waiting for him at the Dunmore Ranch outside of Rock Springs, that he did not know this woman and had no obligation to her. He left before dawn heading east toward Rawlins, which was the wrong direction for Rock Springs and the right direction for a Thursday stage that might have carried a woman named Marcella Alden. He was not entirely sure when he had made the decision, only that he had made it. Rawlins was a railroad town, dusty and loud, with a main street that ran parallel to the Union Pacific tracks and a permanent smell of coal smoke hanging over everything. Owen arrived in the early afternoon and went directly to the stage office, a narrow building wedged between a general store and a saloon. The agent inside was a young man with ink-stained fingers who seemed relieved to have something interesting to do. Yes, he said, a Thursday stage had come through from the Sweetwater station. Stopped at Rawlins for a layover. He checked his ledger, running his finger down the columns. 3 passengers had disembarked at Rawlins. He could not give names for all of them because not everyone signed the full passenger record, but he could say that one of the passengers had been a woman traveling alone who had asked about work at the hotel. Owen's chest did something complicated. Which hotel? Only one worth asking about. The Continental, 2 streets north. The Continental was not what its name suggested. It was a 2-story timber building with a hand-painted sign and a porch that needed 2 of its boards replaced. But it was clean on the inside, and the woman who ran it, a large and capable woman named Mrs. Hennessy, kept it in good order. She confirmed that yes, a young woman named Alden had come in asking about work. She had stayed 2 nights. She had been quiet and polite and clearly educated. She had helped one evening in the dining room when they were short-handed, and she had been good at it, better than some of the hired girls. But she left, Owen said, and something in his voice made Mrs. Hennessy look at him more carefully. She did. Said she'd heard there was a schoolhouse position open in Carbon City and she wanted to look into it. Left on the Monday stage, she paused. "You're not this Gerald Pratt fellow, are you?" She mentioned him briefly, said she hoped he wasn't following her. "No, ma'am," Owen said. "I am not." Mrs. Hennessy studied him for a long moment with the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had seen all manner of men come through her establishment. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. "She was a sweet girl," she said. "Tired around the eyes, though. That kind of tired that comes from being scared for too long. I hope she finds what she's looking for." "Yes, ma'am," Owen said quietly. "So do I." He sent a telegram to the Dunmore Ranch that evening, explaining that he would be delayed by personal business, that he was sorry for the inconvenience, and that he would understand if they filled the position with another man. Then he rode south toward Carbon City, which was 3 days' ride through the high desert country of Carbon County, and he told himself the whole way that he was simply making sure a woman was safe, that any decent man would do the same, that it had nothing at all to do with the way his chest felt every time he thought about the name Marcella Alden. Carbon City was smaller than Rawlins, a mining settlement more than a proper town, with a single main street and a population that fluctuated wildly depending on the season and the state of the mines. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a fresh-built structure that still smelled of cut pine, with a small bell mounted on the roof and 6 narrow windows that let in the afternoon light in long golden bars. Owen found the man in charge of the school committee, a portly banker named Dorman, who confirmed that yes, a Miss Alden had applied for the teaching position. Dorman said she had been impressive in her interview, that she knew her arithmetic and her literature and spoke with authority, and that he had very nearly hired her on the spot. But the school board had ultimately decided to hire a local man who had some teaching experience, and Miss Alden had been given the news 3 days prior. "How did she take it?" Owen asked. Dorman looked uncomfortable. "Graciously. She was very gracious about it, but she seemed," he searched for the word, diminished somewhat when she walked out of that office. Owen sat with that image for a moment too long, a woman walking out of an office graciously diminished. He thanked Dorman and asked where she had gone next. The banker didn't know exactly, but the woman at the post office thought she had seen her board the westbound stage toward a settlement called Ember Creek, where she had heard tell of a family looking for a governess. And so it went. Owen followed the trail of Marcella Alden through the high desert and the scrubland, through small towns and smaller settlements, collecting impressions of her the way other men collected debts. In Ember Creek, the family that had wanted a governess had already found one. In Sage Flat, she had worked 3 weeks at a boarding house until the owner's wife decided she didn't like the way the male boarders looked at her. In a wide-open cattle settlement called Pendleton Crossing, she had taught reading to the children of 3 ranching families for $6 total, which had kept her in food and a rented room for another week. Everywhere Owen went, people remembered her. That was the thing that kept striking him. She was not a woman who moved through the world unnoticed. The hotel keeper in Sage Flat said she had stayed up one night with a sick child of one of the guests, holding the boy's hand until his fever broke. The postmaster in Ember Creek said she had helped an old widow woman write a letter to her son in Ohio and refused any payment for it. The children of Pendleton Crossing had apparently wept when she left, which their rancher fathers reported with a kind of helpless bewilderment, since they were hardy children and not given to weeping. Owen was 2 months behind her origin point, and perhaps 2 weeks behind her actual present location, when he arrived in the town of Harlan's Fork, which was a proper town by the standards of the Wyoming Territory, sitting in a wide valley with the Wind River Range visible to the north and a clear, fast river running through the south end. It had a church, 3 saloons, a proper hotel, a general store, a land office, a bank, and recently and proudly, a schoolhouse with a qualified teacher inside it. He knew before he even pulled his horse to a stop on the main street that something was different here. Harlan's Fork felt settled, purposeful, the way a town feels when it has decided to be something permanent rather than accidental, and he had been in enough incidental towns in the past 2 months to know the difference. He asked about Miss Alden at the general store first, because general stores were always the best source of information about anything in any town, a fact that every experienced traveler knew and most acknowledged only privately. The storekeeper, a lean man named Colton whose apron was permanently stained with coffee grounds and flour, leaned across the counter with the particular interest of a man who liked a good story. "Miss Alden, sure enough, she's here. Been here going on 3 weeks now. Teaching over at the schoolhouse every morning, and she's been helping my wife with the books on Thursday afternoons because my wife can't add to save her life. God love her." He paused. "You a relation of hers?" "No," Owen said. Colton looked at him with those sharp storekeeper's eyes that missed nothing. "Friend?" "Not exactly." Colton wiped down the counter with a cloth that was probably not clean enough for the task. "Well, she ought to still be at the schoolhouse at this hour. End of Main Street, turn left, you'll see the bell." Owen stood for a moment outside the general store after he left, his hand resting on his horse's neck. 2 months he had been following this woman, and now she was 2 streets away, and he was acutely aware that he was a stranger who had read her private letter and spent 60 days chasing after her, which sounded far more alarming stated plainly than it had felt while he was doing it. He had not thought carefully about this moment. He had been too busy thinking about the next stage route or the next relay station to think about what he would actually say. He ran a hand through his hair, settled his hat, and walked his horse down the street. The schoolhouse was easy to find, as Colton had said. The bell on the roof caught the afternoon light, and the sound of children's voices drifted out through the open windows, high and enthusiastic, the sound of a classroom that was actually engaged rather than merely enduring instruction. Owen tied his horse to the fence post outside and stood at the gate for a moment, listening. He heard her voice before he saw her. It was clear and unhurried, warm in the way that warmth sounds when it is genuine rather than performed. And she was reading something aloud to the children, something about rivers and the sea, her cadence rising and falling with natural ease. He stood at the gate long enough that one of the older children noticed him through the window and said something that caused a brief disruption, and then the reading stopped. The schoolhouse door opened, and Marcella Alden stepped onto the small porch. She was not what he had imagined, or rather, she was more than he had imagined, which was the more relevant observation. She was medium height with dark hair pinned up beneath a plain gray bonnet. Her dress the practical dark blue of a woman who had not bought anything new in some time. Her eyes the particular shade of brown that he would later describe to her, embarrassingly, as the color of good creek water over flat stones, which she found both amusing and oddly touching. She was looking at him with calm assessment, the way a woman who had been traveling alone for 2 months learned to look at strangers, measuring the distance between caution and welcome. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was the same as when she had been reading aloud, unhurried, steady. Owen removed his hat. He stood in the afternoon light of Harlan's Fork, Wyoming territory in May of 1878, holding his hat in both hands like a man in a church, and he said, "Miss Alden, I believe I owe you an explanation and possibly an apology for what I'm about to say because I know it sounds strange." She tilted her head very slightly. "Go on." "My name is Owen Talbot. I found your letter." He watched her face. He watched something move through it, swift and complex, surprise and something older, a kind of hope that had learned to hide itself. "The one you left in the Bible at the Sweetwater relay station. I found it about 2 months ago, and I've been looking for you since." The children were absolutely silent inside the schoolhouse, which meant they were listening at the windows, which Marcella appeared to be entirely aware of. She looked at Owen Talbot for a long moment. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with the build of a man who worked outside for a living, and a face that had sun and wind in it without being rough, and eyes that were an unremarkable gray that somehow managed to be very attentive. He did not look like a man who wished her harm. He looked like a man who was embarrassed and sincere and slightly braced for rejection. "Why?" she said. It was the most reasonable question in the world, and Owen had been assembling his answer to it in some form for 2 months and still did not have a clean version of it. "Because you sounded like someone who needed to know that a decent person had read those words," he said, "and I wanted to make sure you were all right." The silence stretched. Then, from inside the schoolhouse, a small voice said, quite clearly, "Is he in love with her?" Another small voice answered immediately, "Obviously, Henry." Marcella turned toward the door with an expression that was severe, but not entirely successful at hiding something around the corners of her mouth. "You will all take out your arithmetic slates and work the problems I assigned this morning, and if I hear another word from this room, there will be additional spelling tomorrow." She turned back to Owen. The expression around the corners of her mouth had not entirely retreated. "Mr. Talbot," she said, "school ends in 1 hour. If you'd like to wait, I'll speak with you properly when I don't have 12 sets of ears pressed against the window glass." He waited. He sat on the fence rail outside the schoolhouse in the late afternoon light and watched the clouds move over the mountains and listened to the quiet industry of children doing arithmetic. And when the bell rang and the children filed out, most of them looked at him with unabashed curiosity. A small boy with red hair and a gap between his front teeth paused directly in front of Owen, studied him with scientific interest, and said, "She reads to us every day and she knows lots of things," which Owen took to be both a recommendation and a warning. "Good to know," Owen said solemnly. The boy nodded and ran off to join the others. Marcella emerged last, carrying a satchel and looking less guarded than she had on the porch, though she had not entirely set aside caution. She gestured down the road toward what appeared to be the main street without exactly inviting him, simply indicating the direction of civilization, and he fell into step beside her. "Tell me how you found the letter," she said. "Tell me the whole of it." So he told her. He told her about the relay station, and the beans he hadn't tasted, and reading the letter 3 times. He told her about the telegram to the Dunmore Ranch, and the trail from Rawlins to Carbon City to Ember Creek to Sage Flat to Pendleton Crossing, and every stop between them. He told her about the boy with the fever and the widow's letter to her son in Ohio, and the children of Pendleton Crossing who had cried when she left. He told her about 2 months of following a trail of impressions, of second-hand accounts that built a picture of a woman who gave more than she took from every place she passed through. He told it all plainly, without embellishment, because embellishment seemed disrespectful to the actual story, which was already extraordinary enough. Marcella walked beside him and listened without interrupting, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment before she said, "You gave up a job." "I did. For a stranger. For a letter," he said. That seemed like more than a stranger. She stopped walking. They were standing at the edge of the main street now, where the road curved slightly and you could see the whole length of Harlan's Fork laid out ahead of you, lanterns beginning to glow in windows as the evening settled. "Mr. Talbot," she said, "I need to tell you something about Gerald Pratt." "You don't have to." "I think I do." She said it firmly, the way she probably said things to children who needed to hear them. "You have followed me 2 months across this territory, and you deserve to understand what you have been chasing after." She looked at the middle distance rather than at him, which he understood was easier. Gerald Pratt was a businessman in Cheyenne, well regarded, 20 years older than I am. My father arranged the marriage before he passed last year. I had met Pratt perhaps 4 times before the engagement was announced. He was not cruel in those 4 meetings, or at least nothing that could be named clearly. But there was something in him that I could not put my finger on until 3 days before the wedding, when he told me, very calmly, that he expected complete obedience in all things and had no interest in a wife with opinions. Owen said nothing. He watched her face. "I had spent my whole life working toward being a teacher," Marcella continued. "I had my certification. I was good at it. And he told me I would not be working once we were married because a wife of his standing did not work, and besides, he said, teaching had given me an unfortunate habit of speaking as though I knew things." She paused. "That was the phrase, an unfortunate habit of speaking as though I knew things." "So you left," Owen said. "I left." She finally looked at him, "with my trunk and $11.40, which seemed like a reasonable amount until I was actually on the stage." "The letter," she hesitated. "I wrote the letter because I felt desperately alone, and the Bible was there, and the relay station keeper had mentioned that travelers often left notes for each other. I did not expect anyone to actually come looking for me based on it. I was simply trying to leave a mark that said I had been real and I had been trying." She stopped. "You said something like that earlier." "I did. I read your letter 3 times. Some things stick." Marcella looked at him for a long moment. The evening light was going golden and it turned everything in the street warm, and she looked, Owen thought, like the woman in the letter made real, the one who had pressed hard on the pen because she needed someone to know. "I don't know what to make of you," she said. "I don't entirely know what to make of myself," he said honestly. "But I rode 2 months to find out." "That seems like data worth having." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Not quite, but almost." "It does, rather," she agreed. She invited him to supper at the boarding house where she stayed, which was run by a woman named Mrs. Falk, who was delighted to have a guest, and served a meal of roast pork and potato that was considerably better than anything Owen had eaten in 2 months. Mrs. Falk asked no impertinent questions, which meant she was either extraordinarily polite or had already constructed the complete story from available evidence and found it satisfactory. Owen suspected the latter. He and Marcella talked through supper and through the hour after, sitting at opposite ends of the small parlor in Mrs. Falk's house with a lamp between them. And they talked about everything and nothing in the way that people do when they are taking each other's measure and finding the measurements compatible. She asked about his life, and he told her, plainly. Born in Missouri, Moved west at 17 with his father who had wanted to ranch but died before he managed it. Spent the years since working cattle for various outfits across Nebraska and Wyoming territory. Owned very little except his horse and his saddle and a small account at a bank in Laramie. He was 31 and had no particular plan for the future beyond the one day directly in front of him, which he admitted was not a plan so much as a habit. Marcella found this more interesting than most men's careful presentations of their prospects, she said. Men who presented prospects always seemed to be selling something. Owen seemed to be simply accounting for himself. He told her that was probably the nicest thing anyone had said to him in recent memory, which made her laugh properly this time, and the sound of it was warm and genuine, and it did something fundamental to the middle of Owen's chest that he was not entirely prepared for. He left at 9 o'clock because Mrs. Falk's house had hours, and he stood on the porch for a moment before he left and said, "I'd like to call on you again if that's all right." Marcella considered. "I have school until 3, she said, "and I'm helping Mr. Colton's wife with the books on Thursday." "I know, he mentioned it." "Of course he did," she looked at him. "Come by Thursday evening then. Mrs. Falk keeps a good porch." He stayed in Harlan's Fork. He found work easily enough, because a man who could rope and ride and fix fence and mend harness was always wanted somewhere, and a rancher named Beaumont who ran cattle in the valley south of town was glad to put him on. The work was honest and the pay was regular and the hours were long, which suited Owen's particular state of mind during those first weeks in Harlan's Fork, because it gave him something to do with his hands and his body, while his mind was occupied with other matters entirely. He called on Marcella on Thursday evening as agreed. He called on her the following Sunday afternoon when school was not in session, and she walked with him along the river road, showing him the country she had been exploring in her free hours, the stands of cottonwood along the water, the places where the river bent sharply and left small sandy beaches that caught the afternoon light. She knew the names of plants he had ridden past his whole life without noticing. She had been looking things up in a natural history book she had found in the town's small lending collection. "You've only been here 3 weeks, he said. "I like to know where I am," she said simply. He thought about that for a long time afterward. He liked to know where he was going next, which was a different thing entirely, and somewhat inferior, it now seemed to him. The courtship proceeded in the particular way of people who are both careful and interested, advancing in small increments that each felt significant. She called him Owen after the 2nd week. He was careful never to presume or push, because he understood without being told that she had come from a situation where a man had presumed enormously, and he wanted no part of being that kind of man for her or for anyone. He liked her too well for any behavior that might dim the clear and particular way she looked at the world. She told him more about her life in smaller pieces over those weeks. Her father had been a schoolteacher himself, which was where she had gotten both the inclination and the training. Her mother had died when Marcella was 12. She had a brother, James, who had gone to California 2 years ago and written erratically, less and less frequently as time passed, and she worried about him in the mild, persistent way of someone who cannot do anything about the thing they are worried about. She had loved her life in Cheyenne before Gerald Pratt had entered it, had been happy in the small school where she had taught for 2 years, had friends there and a small but comfortable routine, and leaving it had cost her more than the $11.40. She had lost everything familiar, though she had gained her freedom, which was not a small thing. "Do you miss it?" Owen asked one evening, sitting on Mrs. Falk's porch with the summer coming on and the stars beginning to show themselves above the mountains. "I miss who I was there," she said honestly. "Before the engagement, before I understood what was coming, there was a version of me that was quite cheerful actually." "You're not cheerful now," she thought about it. "I'm getting there," she said. "It comes back in pieces. Today, for instance, I taught the older children about the geography of the continent, and 2 of them got very excited about the rivers and asked if we could make a map, and I said yes, and that was a cheerful afternoon. What am I? He asked. He kept his voice light, but it was a real question. She looked at him. The porch lamp threw warm light between them. You, she said carefully, are the most unexpected thing that has happened to me in a very long time, and I haven't decided yet what to do with you. That seems fair, he said. I'll wait while you decide. She smiled at the street rather than at him, but it was a real smile and it stayed for a long time. The complication arrived in the form of Gerald Pratt himself on a Wednesday in late June, which was roughly 6 weeks after Owen had found Marcella in Harlan's Fork. Pratt arrived on the morning stage, which Owen knew because he was picking up supplies at Colton's general store when the stage pulled in, and Colton said, with the particular tone of a man delivering news he knows is bad, "That fellow who just stepped off the stage. Marcella described him to Mrs. Colton once, and I'm fairly sure that's him." Owen turned very carefully and looked. Gerald Pratt was a man in his mid-40s, thick through the middle, wearing town clothes that were somewhat too fine for Harlan's Fork, with a manner about him that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any given space. He was speaking to the stage driver with the clipped, dismissive tone of a man who treated service workers as necessary inconveniences, and he was looking around the town with the assessing eyes of a man who had come for something specific. Owen set down his supplies on Colton's counter. "Where's Marcella this morning?" "She'll be at the schoolhouse," Colton said. His voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes were not. Owen left the supplies on the counter and walked out the front of the store and went directly to the schoolhouse by the back roads, moving quickly without running, because running would alarm people and Pratt had not yet done anything except step off a stage. He found Marcella in the middle of a reading lesson with the younger children, and he waited outside until she noticed him through the window and came to the door. She read his face before he said anything. He saw the color change in hers, something going pale beneath the surface. "He's here," she said. It was not a question. "Just arrived on the stage." She stood very straight. He had noticed that she did that, stood very straight when things were difficult, as though posture was a form of preparation. "He has no legal claim on me," she said. "The engagement was terminated. Yes, I am not his property. No. But he's come here because he believes I've humiliated him," she said, which was a more complex and accurate assessment of the situation than Owen had managed to form yet, and it told him something important about how clearly she understood the man who had followed her. "He's not here because he wants me. He's here because I left." "What do you want to do?" Owen asked. She looked at him. Then she looked at the schoolhouse full of children. Then she looked at her own hands for a moment and straightened her already straight spine another fraction. "I want to finish this lesson," she said. "And then I want to speak to him directly, because I am not going to hide from him in my own town." "Your own town," Owen said quietly, and she looked at him sharply and then seemed to hear what she had said. "Yes," she said, "my own town. Will you stand with me when I speak to him?" "I will," he said. "Right beside you, but you do the talking." She nodded. She went back inside and finished the reading lesson, which Owen could only admire because his own nerves were doing things he did not care to examine while he waited on the porch. When the children were released at noon, Marcella walked with Owen to the hotel where Pratt had taken a room, because the town was small enough that his whereabouts were already common knowledge, which was one of the particular qualities of small western towns. She knocked on the door of the hotel parlor where the keeper said he was waiting, and she walked in with her chin level and her hands folded in front of her, and Owen stood at her shoulder. Pratt was shorter in person than Owen had imagined, which was often the way with men who occupied a large amount of psychological space. He looked at Marcella with the expression of a man who was trying to decide whether he was primarily angry or primarily relieved, and the anger seemed to win. "Marcella," he said, as though the name itself were a grievance. "Gerald," she said. "I won't pretend this isn't awkward, but I think it needs to be said plainly. I am not coming back to Cheyenne. I am not resuming the engagement. What existed between us is finished, and it has been finished since the morning I left." "You left without a word," Pratt said. "You embarrassed me in front of the whole city." "I left without a word because I was afraid," Marcella said, "and I believe you know why. I did not want to be the kind of woman you were planning to make of me, and I did not know how to say that to your face without consequence. I know how to say it now. I'm a teacher. I intend to remain a teacher. I'm not looking for a husband who finds that embarrassing." Pratt's eyes moved to Owen, taking in his height and his working clothes and his steady presence. "And this is what you've replaced me with, a ranch hand." "This is Owen Talbot," Marcella said. "He is my friend, and he is standing here because I asked him to. He is not a replacement for anything because you and I were never suited, and I think you know that. And I think if you put your pride aside for a moment, you would feel some relief that this ended before the wedding rather than after." The silence in the hotel parlor was complete. Pratt looked at her for a long time, and Owen watched something move through the man, some contest between his sense of injury and some older, more honest part of himself. He had expected something worse. He had been prepared for worse. But there was something in Marcella's directness that seemed to take the shape of Pratt's argument away from him, because she was not apologizing and she was not frightened, and the only thing he had come here with was the expectation of both. "You're making a mistake," Pratt said finally, but it was the statement of a man who knew it is the expected thing to say rather than a man who truly believes it. "I may be," Marcella said calmly, "but it is mine to make." Pratt looked again at Owen. Owen met his eyes without speaking, because Marcella had been right that this was her conversation, and he had said he would stand beside her, and that was what he was doing. Something in Owen's stillness seemed to settle the matter, because Pratt looked away first. He left on the afternoon stage the following day. He did not seek another audience with Marcella. The town noted his departure with the collective satisfaction of a community that has decided someone is not welcome and watched their conclusion confirmed. Marcella found Owen at the edge of the river road that evening, where he often walked after the day's work was done. She found him easily because it was a small town, and she knew his habits by now, which was itself a kind of intimacy that she was only beginning to examine. She fell into step beside him, and they walked for a while without speaking, listening to the river and the evening birds. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Better than I expected," she said. "I've been afraid of that conversation for months, and it turned out to be almost ordinary." "You were remarkable," he said, "for what it's worth." She glanced at him. "It's worth something," she said. They walked further. "Owen." "Yes." "I've been thinking," she said, in the tone of someone who has been thinking carefully and is now preparing to say the result of that thinking, "about what I told you, that I hadn't decided what to do with you. I remember." "I think I've decided," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The river went past below them in the early evening quiet, silver and fast over the flat stones. "And," he said, his voice was steady and his hands were not entirely. "I think you are the best thing that has happened to me," she said. "And I think I've been waiting to be sure of it before I said so, because I have been wrong about a man before and it cost me considerably. But I am sure now, and I think you should know it." Owen looked at her. The evening light was in her hair and on her face, and she was looking back at him with the same clear directness she had turned on Gerald Pratt in the hotel parlor, which was remarkable only because she was also, very clearly, slightly terrified of his answer. He found that unbearably endearing, that she could be that brave and that frightened at the same time, that she had said the true thing anyway. "Marcella," he said. "I sent a telegram to a ranch in Rock Springs after I read a letter I found in a Bible at a relay station on a Thursday afternoon, and I spent 2 months riding after a woman I had never met. I think you know how I feel." She laughed, and it was the best sound he had heard in 31 years of living. "I suppose I do," she said, "but it's nicer to hear it said." "It's nicer to say it," he admitted. She reached out and took his hand, which was the first time she had touched him deliberately, and the warmth of it moved through him like the sun breaking over a ridge. They stood there by the river for a while longer, not needing to fill the silence, which was the particular luxury of two people who had found, somewhat improbably, exactly the right person. He asked her properly in August, 2 months after that evening by the river. He had not hurried it because she did not need to be hurried, and he did not want to be a man who rushed a woman toward a decision she had not had time to make with her whole heart. He asked her on a Sunday afternoon at the end of the river walk they had made their own, at the particular bend in the water where the cottonwoods grew thickest and the light came through in pieces. He did not have a ring yet. He told her that honestly, that he had been putting money aside but had not yet had time to get to Laramie where there was a proper jeweler. She told him she did not care about the ring. He said he knew, but that he wanted to do this right, which covered both the asking and the eventual ring. She said yes before he had finished the second sentence, which he found both wonderful and typical, and which made him laugh so genuinely that she laughed too, and they stood there in the cottonwoods in August 1878 laughing at nothing and everything. They were married in October of that year, in the church at Harlan's Fork on a Saturday morning when the aspens had gone gold on the mountain slopes, and the air had the particular clarity of high-country autumn. Mrs. Falk cried, which she had warned Marcella she would do and was not embarrassed about. Colton shook Owen's hand so vigorously that Owen's shoulder hurt for a day afterward. The children from the school, many of whom had appointed themselves unofficial witnesses to this whole proceeding, since the afternoon Owen Talbot had appeared at the schoolhouse fence, were seated in the front rows with their best clothes on and expressions of profound satisfaction. The reverend who performed the ceremony was a young man named Walsh, who had been in Harlan's Fork only a year himself, and was still somewhat surprised by the community's enthusiasm for every occasion that called for gathering. He said the words with appropriate gravity and seemed to mean them, and when he said, "You may kiss the bride," Owen took Marcella's face in his hands very carefully, as though she were something rare, and kissed her with all the sincerity of a man who had ridden 2 months through the Wyoming territory because a letter in a Bible had told him she was worth finding. Marcella kept teaching. This was not a point of negotiation or even a point of discussion, because Owen would not have suggested otherwise, and the school board had no interest in losing the best teacher they had ever employed. Owen continued working for Beaumont through the first autumn, and in the winter he and Beaumont came to an arrangement that allowed Owen to lease a section of the valley land with an option to purchase in the following year, which was a beginning of something rather than nothing. And Owen had learned from Marcella that beginnings were worth more than people gave them credit for. They lived the first winter in a small house at the edge of town that they rented from a widow named Mrs. Craddock, who was glad of the income and even gladder of the company, as she was getting elderly and found the winter solitary. Marcella made it a real home in the way that some people have the gift of making any space inhabitable, with small things, a cloth on the table, and a jar of dried flowers on the windowsill, and the natural history book open on the side table, so that Owen could look things up when he passed. He did look things up, and reported his findings to her at supper, and she was always genuinely interested, which he found continuously astonishing. They talked about her brother James in California, and Owen suggested writing to the last address they had for him, which Marcella did. A letter came back in February, 3 months after she had sent hers, reporting that James was alive and working in a mining concern near Sacramento, that he was sorry for being a poor correspondent, that he was glad she had escaped Gerald Pratt, who he had always thought was a cold sort of man, and that he hoped to visit in the coming year. He did not visit in the coming year, but he wrote more regularly after that, which was an improvement. The winter was long and hard, as winters in the Wyoming territory tended to be, with snow that came in November and did not intend to leave until April. Owen worked in the cold with steady practicality, and Marcella taught school on all but the very worst days when the snow was such that the children could not safely make the walk. On those days, she stayed home and graded papers by the fire, and Owen came in from the cold with ice in his beard, and she warmed his hands between hers, which became one of the rituals of their life together, small and essential. He told her, one of those winter evenings, about his father. He had not talked about his father to anyone in years because there was a particular kind of grief that simply lived in you and did not need to be aired regularly. But with Marcella, it felt different, like the thing could be said without becoming larger. His father had been a good man who had wanted too much at once and spread himself thin over 3 different projects and died before any of them bore fruit. And Owen had taken from that not bitterness but a kind of focused patience, the conviction that you picked one thing and you stayed with it. "Is that why you followed the letter?" she asked. "You picked one thing." He thought about it. "I think once I'd read it there wasn't a choice that made sense to me except going," he said. "I don't know that it was a decision so much as a recognition." "A recognition of what?" "That there was a person in that letter," he said, "a real one. And real people in genuine need of someone decent to know about them are not something you walk away from." Marcella was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow was doing something complicated with the wind. "Owen," she said. "Yes." "I'm very glad you read my letter." "So am I," he said, "every day." In the spring, when the snow released its grip, and the valley went green with a speed that always seemed slightly miraculous after the gray of winter, they moved out of Mrs. Craddock's house and into a proper place of their own, a 2-room structure on the land Owen had leased from Beaumont, solidly built and freshly chinked against the weather. It was not large, but it was theirs, sitting in the valley with the Wind River Range visible to the north and the river road visible to the south. And in the first week they lived there, Marcella stood at the window in the early morning and looked at the mountains and said, "I want to know the names of every peak I can see from this window." And Owen said, "I'll find you a surveyor's map." And she said, "I already found one." And he was not surprised at all. The summer of 1879 was warm and productive. Owen's cattle were doing well. Marcella's school had grown to 18 students, which required the school board to authorize a second schoolroom, a discussion that occupied 3 contentious public meetings before being resolved in favor of expansion. Marcella made her case at the 3rd meeting with the same calm directness she had employed with Gerald Pratt in the hotel parlor, and the result was the same. It was in the fall of 1879 that Marcella told Owen she was expecting a child, which she did by handing him a cup of coffee at the breakfast table and saying, "I should tell you something," in the tone that meant it was something significant. He set down the cup. She told him. He sat very still for a moment with the expression of a man receiving information that is simultaneously the best and most alarming thing he has ever heard. "Are you all right?" she asked, which was what he always asked her, and she intended it with the same sincerity. "I'm very much better than all right," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. Are you feeling well?" "I feel fine," she said. "I've been feeling fine for weeks, actually. I just wanted to be sure before I said anything." He reached across the breakfast table and took her hand, and she turned it over and held his, and they sat there in the morning light in their 2-room house in Harlan's Fork with the mountains visible through the window. And Owen thought about his father who had wanted too much at once and spread himself thin, and how differently he had arranged his own life. One thing followed through to its completion, and how the completion had turned into this, a morning like this, a hand in his like this. And it seemed to him like the most astonishing achievement of his life, not because he had done anything particularly remarkable, but because he had simply been willing to follow what mattered. Their son was born in the spring of 1880, on an April morning when the river was high with snowmelt and the valley was spectacularly, excessively green. He was healthy and loud, and had, from the first hours, an expression of intent assessment that both of them recognized immediately as Marcella's. They named him William, which was Owen's father's name, and the choice of it meant something that Owen did not entirely have words for, but that Marcella understood without words being necessary. Mrs. Falk was one of the first to come calling, and she cried again, which she said was not her fault but was simply the consequence of caring about people and finding them well. Colton sent over a parcel of provisions with a note that said, "Congratulations. The town is very pleased," which was presumptuous but also accurate. The children from the school sent a card that 23 small hands had signed, some of them more legibly than others. Owen held his son with the careful precision of a man who is aware that he is holding the most important thing he has ever held and is concentrating very hard on doing it correctly. Marcella watched him from the bed, tired and happy, and thought about the letter she had left in the Bible at the Sweetwater relay station in the spring of 1878, written in a moment of loneliness and fear, leaving a mark that said she had been real and she had been there and she had been trying. It had worked better than she could possibly have imagined when she tucked it between the pages. "What are you thinking about?" Owen asked, without looking up from the baby. "The relay station," she said. He did look up then. "Which one?" "The Sweetwater one, where you found the letter," he smiled. It was not his usual expression, which was contained and steady. This was something different, open and unguarded in the way that only complete happiness produces. "I think about it sometimes," he said. "The fact that I almost didn't read it. The Bible was just sitting there on the windowsill and I almost left it alone." "But you didn't." "No," he said. "I didn't." William made a small imperious sound, and Owen's attention returned to him immediately with the wholeness that characterized everything Owen did. Marcella settled back against her pillow and looked at her husband and her son in the morning light, and felt the particular, profound satisfaction of a woman who has come through something hard and arrived somewhere better than she had planned. The years that followed built themselves in the way of good years, steadily, and with accumulation. Owen purchased the land from Beaumont in the second year and added to it modestly in the third, building the herd with patience and practicality. Marcella continued teaching until William was old enough to be left mornings, and then she returned to the school, because it was hers in the way that things you have fought for are yours, and neither the school board nor anyone else suggested she should not. She was the best teacher in Carbon County by general agreement, and 2 families had specifically moved to Harlan's Fork because of the quality of the schooling, which Colton pointed out with territorial pride to anyone who suggested Harlan's Fork was too small to amount to much. The schoolroom that had been expanded to accommodate 18 students was expanded again to accommodate 30, and then a second teacher was hired to handle the younger grades. A young woman from Ohio named Miss Pierce, who arrived nervous and settled quickly under Marcella's mentorship into something competent and assured. Watching Marcella with Miss Pierce, Owen thought about what Gerald Pratt had said, the unfortunate habit of speaking as though she knew things, and found the contempt of it more incredible every year, as though knowing things were a habit to be corrected, as though knowing things weren't precisely the gift that made her irreplaceable in this town and in this life. The injustice of it did not stop occurring to him. He thought sometimes about the broader shape of what he had stumbled into following that letter. A woman of education and skill, trained and certified and genuinely gifted, reduced to $11.40, and a Bible at a relay station, because a man with money and social standing had decided her competence was inconvenient. He had seen other versions of it in his travels, women who were capable of far more than the world's arrangement allowed them, and the recognition of it in Marcella's story had sharpened something in him that he could not name, but that affected the way he moved through the world. He was not a man given to speeches or politics, but he was the husband who built the second bookshelf without being asked, who carried Marcella's papers to the schoolhouse when she had her hands full, who made sure that every family on their stretch of road knew that Mrs. Talbot's opinion on a child's education was worth considerably more than their reluctance to take instruction from a woman. He made these points quietly and effectively, which was his way. They had a second child in 1883, a daughter they named Clara, who arrived with considerably less drama than her brother, and was from the first a calm and observational baby, who seemed to be processing information at a rate that amused both parents. William was 3, and received his sister with a mixture of suspicion and scientific interest that gradually resolved into something resembling proprietary affection. He was already learning to read under his mother's patient instruction, which he found alternately fascinating and frustrating, and which Marcella navigated with the same steady warmth she brought to her classroom. Owen built the house out that year, adding 2 rooms onto the original structure, which had always been intended as a beginning. He did the carpentry himself over the late summer and early fall, working on it in the evenings after the ranch work was done, and Marcella brought him water and inspected the progress every day with the same attention she gave to essays and arithmetic problems. When it was finished, she walked through the new rooms and was very quiet, and he watched her from the doorway and said, "Is it all right?" She turned and looked at him and said, "Owen, it's wonderful," with a sincerity that went straight through him the way it always did, 2 decades of sincerity later, still completely effective. In the fall of 1884, a letter arrived from James in California, not erratically but deliberately, long and carefully written, announcing that he had done well enough in his mining ventures to consider returning east. Not to Cheyenne, he said, because Cheyenne held nothing for him now, but perhaps to Wyoming territory if there were opportunities. He asked Marcella if Harlan's Fork was a good town. Marcella wrote back immediately that Harlan's Fork was a very good town, that a man who was willing to work could find plenty of it, and that furthermore there was a bedroom in the new addition that would be his if he wanted it while he found his footing. She did not consult Owen before writing this letter, but when she told him what she had written, he said only, "Good," and meant it, which she had known he would, which was one of the many reasons she had married him. James arrived the following spring, thinner than Marcella remembered, and with a beard he had not had when he left for California, but fundamentally himself. He shook Owen's hand and thanked him in the direct and somewhat uncomfortable way of men who find gratitude difficult to express but feel it genuinely, and Owen received it in kind. James found work at the land office within a fortnight, which suited his numeracy and his patience, and within a year he had a room of his own in town and a quiet courtship with the postmaster's daughter, which resolved itself pleasantly and added another family to Harlan's Fork's permanent population. The town grew through the latter half of the 1880s with the particular momentum of places that have made up their minds to be something. A bank expanded. A second general store opened, which Colton regarded with irritation, and then with rueful acceptance when it became apparent that the town could support both. The railroad was extended to a junction 20 miles south, which changed the logistics of everything and brought new families and new commerce and new complications in equal measure. The school absorbed more children. Marcella hired a 3rd teacher, a young man named Holt who had been educated in Pennsylvania, and who brought with him a globe and an enthusiasm for geography that made him immediately popular with the older students. Owen's ranch settled into the comfortable rhythm of a well-run operation. Not large, not ambitious beyond what the land could sustain, but reliable and sound, the kind of enterprise that a man could hand to a son in time without it being a burden. William began coming along for the day's work as soon as he was old enough to be useful, which was earlier than Marcella would have preferred, but which Owen managed with careful attention to the boy's actual capacity and the specific requirements of safety. Clara showed little interest in the cattle and enormous interest in her mother's bookshelf, which was now 2 shelves, and in the maps that covered one wall of the expanded house, and Marcella watched her daughter with a pleasure that was also recognition. On an evening in the summer of 1886, Owen and Marcella sat on the porch of their house in the valley south of Harlan's Fork, with the mountains going purple in the late light, and the sound of their children settled for the night behind them, and it was an evening that required nothing of either of them except to be in it. Owen had a cup of coffee growing cool beside him. Marcella had a book open in her lap that she was not reading. "Are you happy?" she said, which was not something she asked often, not because she doubted the answer, but because it seemed important to ask periodically, to make the thing real by speaking it. Owen looked at the mountains and then at his wife. "I have been happy since the afternoon I found you at the schoolhouse fence," he said. "I have been happy every day since. Some days more than others because that's how days work, but underneath all of it, yes, happy." She closed her book. "I have been happy since you told me you'd read the letter 3 times," she said. "I thought, this man read my letter 3 times and then rode after me for 2 months. If that isn't someone paying attention, I don't know what is." "You have always deserved someone paying attention," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I didn't know it when I was sitting in that relay station writing a letter to nobody, but I know it now." They sat in the evening quiet together, and the stars came out above the Wind River Range one by one in the deepening sky. And below in the valley, the river was silver in the last light, running fast over the flat stones that Owen had once, embarrassingly, described as creekwater brown. And Marcella had the natural history book somewhere inside with its pressed wildflowers marking various pages. And William and Clara were asleep in the rooms Owen had built with his own hands one September evening. And James was in town with his new wife and their particular contentments. And all of it, every piece of it, could be traced back with perfect clarity to a letter pressed into a Bible at a relay station in the spring of 1878, written by a woman who was frightened and honest enough to say so, and found by a man who was decent enough to act. Years later, when William was grown and asking his father about how he had come to settle in Harlan's Fork, Owen told him the story from the beginning. The relay station, the Bible, the beans he hadn't tasted, the 2 months of riding. He told it plainly, without embellishment, which was the only way he knew to tell things that were important. William listened with the full attention of a young man who has just realized his parents were young once and made choices that were not inevitable. He asked Owen what had made him pick up the letter in the first place. Owen thought about it. It was sticking out of the Bible at an angle, he said, like it was trying to be found. And if it hadn't been sticking out, Owen considered this seriously, then I suppose I'd have gone to Rock Springs and worked for the Dunmore Ranch and never known the difference, he said, which is why I'm grateful that someone didn't press it in flat. William looked at his mother, who was in the other room and who they could hear moving around with the efficiency of a woman who had 17 things to accomplish before supper. "Did she know that?" he asked. "That she'd left it sticking out?" "I don't think she thought about it," Owen said. "She was frightened and she needed to leave a mark. She put the letter in the Bible and she got back on the stage." He paused. "But I think the part of her that needed to be found pressed it in exactly as deeply as it needed to be pressed." William sat with that for a moment. He had his mother's eyes and his father's stillness, which was an effective combination. "That's a good story," he said. "It's not a story," Owen said. "It's what happened." Marcella appeared in the doorway then, looking between them with the mild suspicion she deployed when her husband and her son were sitting too quietly. "What are you two talking about?" "You," Owen said. She looked at him for a moment with those creekwater brown eyes. "Good things, I hope." "The best things," he said. She made the sound that was almost a laugh, the one he had first heard on Mrs. Falk's porch and had been collecting ever since, the one that told him she was genuinely pleased and slightly embarrassed about it, and she went back to whatever she had been doing before supper. Owen watched the doorway for a moment after she disappeared through it, and William watched his father watch the doorway, and understood without being told everything that needed to be understood about what a good life looked like, and how it could begin with the strangest and most unexpected of things. The letter itself was still in existence. Marcella had found it in Owen's things during the first winter they were married, tucked in the pocket of his good coat, and she had looked at it for a long time before she asked him about it. He had explained, somewhat sheepishly, that he had not known what to do with it after he found her, and that it seemed wrong to throw it away. She had considered this, and then folded it carefully and put it in the small wooden box where she kept the things that mattered: the letter her father had written her when she got her teaching certification, the pressed flower from the Cottonwood Bend where Owen had asked her to marry him, and a photograph taken on their wedding day that showed them both looking slightly stunned by their own happiness. It was a fine collection, she thought. A life's evidence, small and sufficient. Clara found the box eventually, as children find all the things that matter to parents, and she asked about each object with the methodical interest she brought to everything. And when Marcella explained the letter, what it was and where it had been found and what had followed from it, Clara held it with careful hands and read it in its entirety, and then looked up at her mother with something complex moving through her young face. "You were brave," Clara said. "I was frightened," Marcella corrected. "They're not opposites," Clara said, which she had heard somewhere but which she also believed, and Marcella looked at her daughter for a moment with a heart so full that she could not immediately find words for it, which was unusual for a woman who taught language for a living. "No," she said finally, "they're not. I learned that somewhat late." "How late?" "Late enough," Marcella said, "but in time." She put the letter back in the box, and the box back in its place, and went back to the business of the afternoon. Outside, Owen was coming in from the south pasture with William behind him, and the mountains were doing something spectacular with the evening light, and the river road was visible through the window, and the school bell at the edge of town could be heard faintly through the clear air, ringing the end of the school day with the same tone it had rung since 1878. When a woman with $11.40 and her whole uncertain future had walked up to a fence post and looked at a man who had ridden a very long way to find her. She had never stopped being grateful for the sticking-out angle of that letter, she thought, watching Owen cross the yard. Or for the man who had read it 3 times and done something about it. Or for herself, for having the presence of mind to write it down in the first place, when she was frightened and alone in a relay station that smelled of horses and wood smoke, and had pressed her pen hard into the paper because it seemed necessary for someone to know she had been real. She had been real. She was real. She was here, in this house she had helped build, in this town that was hers, with this life that was hers, and the mountains outside her window had names she had looked up in a surveyor's map and memorized. And the river road was one she had walked so many times that she knew every curve of it. And when the door opened and Owen came in from the yard and looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with the full and concentrated attention of a man who had ridden 2 months through the Wyoming territory because a letter told him she was worth finding, she thought, yes, this is what it means to be found. This is what it means to be real and to know it. The evening settled over Harlan's Fork with the particular gentleness of high-country summers, warm and unhurried, the light going golden and then rose, and then the clean dark blue of a clear night coming on. Owen sat beside his wife on the porch they had built onto the house, and William and Clara were somewhere on the property doing what children do on summer evenings, and the sound of them drifted back now and then, distant and reassuring. The stars came out above the mountains one by one, as they always did. "I love you," Owen said without preamble, because he said it when he felt it, and he felt it tonight with the particular clarity that some evenings brought, a kind of distillation of everything the ordinary days contained. "I love you," Marcella said back, in the same tone, direct and genuine, the way she had always said the true things. "I loved you from about the 3rd week, you know. I just had to be sure of it first." "I know," he said. "I waited. You were very patient." "I had ridden 2 months across the territory to find you," he said. "A few more weeks seemed manageable." She laughed. He sat beside her in the evening and listened to the sound of it, and thought, not for the first or the last time, about a Bible on a windowsill and a letter sticking out at an angle, and the impossible, ordinary miracle of the whole thing. He reached over and took her hand, as he had on the night she had said he was the best thing that had happened to her, standing by the river in the last of the summer light. She held his hand back, as she always did, and they sat in the warm dark of a Wyoming evening, in the middle of a life that was built and solid and entirely, wonderfully theirs. And there was nothing left open between them, no thread unsettled, no question unresolved. Only the ongoing good fact of each other and the mountains and the years ahead. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.